Guess I'll get started. Hi, I'm Anthony Berryhill. I'm the founder and CEO of Elite College Hacker. Elite College Hacker is a people development company that works on primarily in college applications and admissions, from undergrad to PhD to even trying to get jobs at places like Goldman Sachs and McKinsey. So what we do at our company is help people, transform themselves into the kinds of people who get the opportunities and social mobility that not just in American society, but across the globe, people don't normally have access to. In this talk, I'll talk about my own journey developing this skill set and helping people get where they need to go in life, and also a lot of the lessons I learned in that regard. As a thank you for everyone watching this, I'm willing to offer a free 30-minute consultation. You just have to email me at anthony@elitecollegehacker.com. You can also go to that website at www.elitecollegehacker.com, and I'd be happy to have a chat with you about where you are. Even if you're someone who's out of the workplace, I've had lots of experience working as a vice president in HR, to various learning opportunities at Yale, Stanford, Harvard, what have you. And I'd love to find people who are like-minded. So in terms of the talk, I'll start now. W.B. Du Bois is very famous for a lot of works, particularly a book that's often taught in high schools called Souls of Black Folk. But when I was at Yale doing my PhD in political theory, I had to revisit W.B. Du Bois because he's someone who my entire life I've been inspired by. He was the first Black PhD at Harvard. He wrote numerous books, tens of books, where he spent a lot of time studying multiple different avenues, from social science to psychology to brain science, to try to convince America that Black Americans were equal, that they deserved education, they deserved the ballot, they deserved to be treated as full citizens. But the problem that Du Bois realized, that many scholars have realized, including up to Martin Luther King, is that a lot of people, and I'm not just Black people, but just people in America, we have a challenge where we have multiple identities. At one point, we were proud of the United States and our country and where we're from, but we're also excluded by the very communities that we're a part of, our families, the school, the police, what have you. So in this context, Du Bois, near the end of his life in his scholarship, asked the following question: how does it feel to be a problem? This is not a quote that's taught in American schools for good reason. This is a very radical question. This is a question that Du Bois posed to America. And why did he pose that question? Because again, he was in this paradox, a paradox that across my whole life that I'll talk about in this talk, that is hard to describe and is often understudied and is certainly not talked about in social impact or social media. The problem is this: what do we do when on one hand we are part of a community of Americans, all of us equal in the eyes of law, supposedly. But on the other hand, we have parts of ourselves that make us subhuman in the same system, that make us subject to being shot by the police for having Skittles, that make us seen unqualified just because we come from a poor background. So, how does it feel to be a problem? Du Bois didn't answer this question. The way he addressed it was talking about notion of dual consciousness and a lot of the scholarship that a lot of people use today. But this is not a unique question to Du Bois. It was also asked by Sojourner Truth when she said, "Ain't I a woman?" She was frustrated that although she also believed that women deserved equal rights and should be part of the feminist movement, that white women refused to include her. That kind of tribalism excluded her too. It left her on the outside looking in. It left her being an outsider insider. Martin Luther King, the same thing. As much as he's talked about having a dream, he at the end of his life, he got very, very frustrated. To a point where instead of talking about color blindness, like many on the right like to misquote him, he started talking about the fact that Black Americans who did everything right, did all the education, scholarship, and were nonviolent, they were given a check with insufficient funds. He warned that riots were inevitable, not evil, in a world where his community or the communities of African Americans left them structurally oppressed. This brings me to my story. My story is an unusual story. It's not a story that diversity, equity, inclusion oriented companies will tell. It's not a story that major charter schools will tell either, because it's a very radical story. It is the story of Elite College Hacker, but it's a story that's a human story. Question is three questions about this story. First, how do we find our place in the world where the places we're from have failed us, when they exclude us for the rare reasons that we're great, awesome, and add to the world? Second, how do we stay sane in this process when we can't even look to our own parents, our families, our dating partners, or those in our community or our friends for emotional support or acceptance? What do we do? I hope to give some guidance on that question. And most of us, how do we lift ourselves? How do we achieve the social mobility that we may not have because we were born in the projects or born to a rural community or places where we're not seen, where our conversations are not talked about by the left or the right, and where no one seems to care? This talk talks about three phases of my journey answering these questions. From the inner city of New Orleans to a very rigorous high school in Stanford to eventually becoming an admissions coach to help the world's students overcome this kind of structural oppression. My argument is this, that the story of Elite College Hacker and my story is an extreme story, but it's not a black and white one. It's not a rich, poor one. It is a human one. And then when we think about the curriculum of our lives and what it takes to be socially mobile, to be treated as human beings by our own communities, this requires a hacker approach, requires a radical approach that does not follow, let's just say, performative politics. So part one is my origin story. My story started in 36, at 3615 Desire Parkway. This was the school's relevant school or Dunn Elementary and Edwards Elementary. Now, one would say that that the Ninth Ward before Katrina was better off than it was after. I say the opposite. The students who went to these schools, even at the elementary school level, face immense amounts of danger and violence, and I did too. If you look at the schools and the data, there was a series of schools that fed into each other. Edwards Elementary to Carver Middle and High School. These were the schools that if you're on my way, you would never quite literally leave this neighborhood for the rest of your life. And these were the schools you were expected to attend, partly due to mandatory zoning policies, but other part because people in these neighborhoods didn't have money or resources. And the evidence is clear. Of the students who were in the top 10 at Carver High School, the school that I was supposed to attend, very rarely did any of the top 10 students finish in 4 years for your degree. They were often 1 to 2 years behind in remedial classes. Those, those who did try an attempt faced massive violence, nonstop, nonstop discrimination, not just from the students who attacked them for acting white or whatever terms were used by these schools, but also by the teachers who treated them as role models or as tools to promote the overall good of the community over the safety of the individual. In my situation, what this looked like in elementary school was that I represented very much a radical departure from what I was supposed to be. As the youngest of four boys, I was very much a nerd. I left my mom's womb, as she tells me, quite short, very quiet, and very nerdy. I taught myself how to read by playing 1980s Nintendo games, which were, let's just say, much more reading than most kids do today in an AI world. But the consequences of this were not entirely positive. Because of the depraved nature of this school, where very few students, graduated high school, very few were even at grade level when they attended middle school, the model of the teachers, who were all Black and female, was very much to treat me as a quote unquote role model, to tell my parents that I had a God-given ability and trait. This seems like these are positive traits, but anyone who's read the literature on the school to prison pipeline and specific ways that Black boys are treated would know that this is a catastrophe waiting to happen. And it was. My own peers often beat up on me every day because they were so frustrated by this kind of juxtaposition. The teachers encouraged my mom and my parents to beat me because they said to my parents, he talks too white, or rather, he's forgetting where he comes from, or he always raises his hand. These actions are supposed to be positive educational actions, but very much due to racism, due to Jim Crow, due to gangster rap, etc. These were often treated as evil things that had to be beaten out of me. The result of this were 2 suicide attempts, and even once bringing a knife to school because I knew that the teachers did not value my safety. The way I got out of this was at 8 to 9 years old, realizing that the benefits of doing what I'm supposed to do by the adults in my life would be teen pregnancy, HIV, death, and crime. So in 5th grade, a program called Summer Bridge found me. They went to my elementary school because it was one of the worst performing ones. A bunch of students, who were in high school said, "Hey, do you want to go to a summer school and meet friends?" No one raised their hands for the very reason that I was also being attacked. To quote a fellow 9-year-old in 4th grade, the reason I don't want to get great grades in school is because I don't want to be beaten up and mistreated like the way you are. That's why we don't study. That's why we don't take it seriously. So ironically, the very logic of meaning from the left is the very same logic that dooms most African American boys in particular to running away, else they will have no dating life, no family support, and they will be attacked for their gender, for their bodies, or the way they speak, even though it's in line with education. So in fifth grade, the way I survived this was through Summer Bridge, which is now known as the Breakthrough Collaborative. But the first lesson here is in place. Summer Bridge did not tell me that I could make excuses based on the fact that I had a very abusive, situation at home. Instead, they required us to do homework, 2 to 3 hours of homework a night during the summer. They completely banned the kind of bullying and violence that was normalized. And the very people in my neighborhood who were worrying that I would leave, but then making it impossible to stay. In other words, they taught agency. And this is a lesson that applies to everyone listening here. It's not a black or white issue, it's a human issue. Agency is the ability to take responsibility and control of how we think and where our goals are. We cannot control the situations that happen to us, but we can control if we believe that those situations are of us. For years, I asked myself whether or not I should even exist on the planet, because even the way I speak, the vocabulary I use, have been used often by people of my own color to argue that I don't belong in the Black community, that I don't belong in the DEI community, that I don't belong on the left. This is not an argument for Republicans, but rather it's an argument that when we talk about structural oppression, we need to be serious about what structure means. Those structures are not simply the police, although they're a part of it. Those structures are also the very people who called my mom when I was leaving that elementary school and were worried that I would leave the community by going to a college prep school and never return. Which brings me to the second point, the importance of self-development. It's not enough to get out of the projects or to go to a Harvard or Stanford. What's important is that people need to learn how to develop themselves. How do they protect and build themselves up for spaces that are not designed for them? Thankfully, Summer Bridge saved my life. What I was told by another student was that if had I gone to Harvard High School, I would be facing almost certain sexual assault and rape. Why? Because of the very same jealousy and attacks that made the students very upset. So therefore, Summer Bridge did for me, they literally saved my life and my own dignity. They got me to a school called Isidore Newman, which was known for those from my neighborhood to host the best people who are the best football and basketball players. But that was not me. I was a nerd, if you remember. I was strictly on academic scholarship, having to take 2 standardized tests to show that I could keep pace. But when I first started there, the tests I took in class were nothing like what I was taught in school. In school, in the New Orleans public school system, we were taught to do things like memorize a study guide, use flashcards, and read the textbook 18 hours. But when I went to Isidore Newman, it was nothing like that. Taking tests there was like being a Klingon in Star Trek and not knowing what language you're hearing is. We were not asked questions like, tell us the definition of mitosis in our biology class. We were asked questions like, in what stage do the spindles rotate 180 degrees during mitosis? In other words, there is a difference of level that is never discussed when students go to college, when students go to high school. Even programs like KIPP and for America, while they do great work, there are gaps in terms of the ability to talk about these things at a deep structural level. It's not enough to get students to represent African-American students on campuses. We have to make sure they know what they're doing and that they can thrive once they're there. No one taught me these lessons when I went to Newman, and then when I went to Stanford as well. I was very much thrown, like most of the social impact world in the United States, thrown into these spaces, thrown into an HBCU school, thrown into Stanford, and in many cases, as one of my extracurriculars, thrown into debate without anyone making the connection between where I was and what I needed to be. The benefit of the terror of this actually is that it felt alone. But the benefit is that it allowed me to learn how to use reverse engineering to survive very difficult places, very difficult communities. In my case, at Newman, the way I survived was that I knew that I could study my way through it. I read stuff on how to study, actual books, how to memorize techniques from memory experts, and use what we would call Metacrawler, or those days Google, in order to fill in the gaps that I didn't have because I was not born to a rich family with parents who supported my educational pursuits. I also did debate in high school. Greg Mellis, a Hall of Fame coach who teaches at my old alma mater, he saw me during a mandatory English class and demanded I join the debate team. My parents were absolutely horrified. They were shocked. They did not understand what I was doing, but I did it anyway. And when I thank him for doing that, it's because it gave me the argumentative structures, the strategies that are not taught to students today. And in so doing, I went from a stuttering kid with PTSD due to my experience in the inner city schools, to someone able to compete with the world's best students and essentially being a top 20. The lesson here is that when we take our own experiences and self-develop, we can make ourselves the kind of people who achieve the goals we want, even if other people tell us that we don't deserve them. I'll conclude with what I do now, the admissions work. My work in education is completely involuntary. My students have demanded it. I never wanted to be an admissions officer. I didn't think I'd be wearing a Harvard polo today. The reason this happens because my debate students, while I was at Stanford, teaching and starting teams in order to pay the bills, because full tuition scholarships didn't go very far. They were Asian American students from Northern California. The schools I taught, Mission, San Jose, and Harker, they at the time, about 15 or 20 years ago, they were not competitive. Mission San Jose in particular had a 0% win-loss record. They were told by, I will name the coaches, they were told by the coaches in the league that they were misfits, that they didn't belong, that I was just that coach wearing Airwalk shoes with a kick scooter. My point here is that when we're looking at these elite spaces, we're often told that we don't belong because we don't fit the social curriculum in those places. This is even true at Stanford and Yale. That often what distinguishes a kid who can get into a top club like investment banking is not whether or not they have experience, but rather whether or not they're read as having a good family, having enough money, looking the part, playing a sport if you're a Black man. My Asian American students went through their own version of this kind of discrimination, similar to what I face in the inner city. They were not beaten for doing homework. They were not called gay because they didn't listen to rap, but they faced their own oppression. They had class expectations that told them that they had to dress a certain way in order to be accepted. Their parents would often drive these students crazy, helicoptering, imposing norms that were assumed by the community in Northern California that had nothing to do with how Stanford, Yale, or Harvard make decisions. These kids were told, so their version of being told, do rap in sports or you don't count as a black man. Their version was, if you don't do tennis, if you don't do 19 APs, if you don't study computer science, you do not belong in our family. These students came to me on a referral only basis. I did not and have not advertised my work, but they reached out to me because some of them I coached through debate, but others had heard about me because they were being driven crazy and they didn't want to lose in the admissions game. One student was a football player. He was made fun of because he was a football player, and everyone in his family told him he shouldn't even write about it. But I did. I was then fired for telling him to do this. And then the student, realizing he was in trouble, came back to me saying, please just work with me anyway in secret. That essay that he was told did not belong in the Asian American community got a 3.5 student into the University of San Diego, one of the most competitive schools in the country. Another student, an Indian student, she was a hardcore feminist theorist of the best type. She knew all the literature at the PhD level. She did a lot of work to encourage electoral politics representation, and not just for other Indian women, but for women more broadly. She and I agreed, and told the mom, that the dad could not read the essay because due to his own religious beliefs, he would quite literally have a heart attack. We hid that from him, a radical strategy that's not done by college admissions officers, but that I knew because I knew the literature from my PhD times. I knew that she knew what she was talking about, and her admissions officers as well. She got into 4 Ivies, every UC school, etc. But hacking these systems has pushback. Earlier in that year, this student told me, call me by phone. One of many difficult conversations I have, one of therapy level conversations, is that their 4 boys were not making fun of her, but telling her stuff because they knew that she had 4 Bs on her transcript. Yes, in these environments, people know your grades. And they told her that she had no chance at Harvard because of it. When she told me this story, I laughed. I won't exactly quote the exact language I used to tell her, but I told her to tell them in so many words to go to heck and to wait until the Ivy League day to see what would happen. In March of that year, she called me and said those 4 boys went to her car. They stalked her, not literally, but figuratively. And they said, how the heck did you get into Stanford or those schools? And per my instructions, she told them to go elsewhere. What was the difference? The difference was what I teach. Lesson 3, authenticity. Instead of writing about how much she loved math and science, she wrote about things that even would piss off her own community, similar to how when I read about debate and Black feminist thought, it made my own community and many in that world very upset. By doing what the stakeholders want, by fitting into those structures, she was able to find social mobility in places that her community, the people around her, her families, were structurally denying her based on their own arguments, stereotypes, etc. And that speaks to Elite College Hacker and what we do. We build agency in people regardless of where they're from. This is a trauma-inspired experience. It's reverse engineered from being someone who had no instruction book and had no one to rely on. We encourage self-development. We don't believe that people are victims. We instead believe they should be victors, in the words of Big Brother winner, the Big Brother winner from a few years ago. And we emphasize authenticity. We reject passion projects. We don't believe that you have to be an extrovert in order to get into the Wharton School of Business. In fact, the world's elite institutions are completely the opposite of American social curricula. What I have found in my experience is not that we should sell out or change ourselves, but rather we should eliminate the limited beliefs that tell us that we don't belong, that we don't look the part, that we have to sound a certain way, or shouldn't belong. So what's my call to action to you? My call to action to you, no matter where you are, whether you're in school or 60 years old or in corporate America, is to first find peace in where you are and who you are. There's a lot of, especially nowadays, there's a lot of pressure for people to rank order themselves, to beat up on others because they need to feel good for themselves. The more that we can work on having our own sense of judgment, the better we are. Alyssa Liu, the figure skater, is a good example of this. That when she won, after she did a performance, she didn't care about what the score was. She was even swearing. She was in our whole world, and that's how we should all be when we're doing our own work. Finally, second, we should not be afraid to use the resources around us. Too often, folks in my kind of position who are in poverty are folks who are trying to build themselves up from the Jim Crow based economy we have. They don't want to leave their state because they don't want to leave their family. They don't want to use AI because it seems odd. They don't want to do the things that would upset the people around them as they evolve. But we can never have that world of social equality if we stay where we are. That leads to the next part. We should always find our own tribe. No matter where you are in your profession, that if you have one set of people telling you you don't belong, there's always another set. In my world, I never thought that Stanford would be a place that would belong to me. The only reason I even knew about it was because I was aware of the Stanford debate tournament as a competing student. I'll leave you with one story. The night that the Stanford application was due in 1999, sorry, in 2000, I I had written the application in about 40 minutes. Right. I had no confidence that I had any chance of getting in. In fact, I was not even the top 30% at Newman. But I wrote it anyway. I said to myself, what the heck? And I almost didn't press the button to submit. As the timer went down, 11:59, 04, dot, dot, to 42, to 56, I had a decision to make, and a decision that would be a life-changing one. Do I condemn myself to imposter syndrome and what I've been told in the lower ninth ward, or do I hit the button and say, I'm willing to take the risk and I can handle what happens on the other side? 1 second left to go, I hit the button, and the rest is history.